The sun had barely risen over the Rocky Mountains when Staff Sergeant James Miller began his morning patrol. At 40 years old, his weathered face told stories of countless missions and 20 years of military service. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he adjusted the straps of his backpack, a habit formed from years of carrying much heavier gear in far more dangerous places. This mountain range near Fort Carson, Colorado, had become his sanctuary over the past 3 years. After serving multiple tours in Afghanistan, James found peace in these solitary morning patrols. The military base where he now trained young recruits sat nestled in the valley below, its buildings looking like tiny boxes from his current elevation of 9,000 feet. The morning routine never changed. James would start his hike at sunrise, checking the lesser-known paths that tourists often strayed onto, despite warning signs. He knew every rock and tree along his usual route, marking them in his mind like old friends. The path wound through pine forest before opening up to rocky cliffs that offered views stretching for miles. Today felt different somehow. The morning air carried an unusual stillness. Normally, birds would be calling to each other, and small animals would scatter at his approach. But the mountain seemed to hold its breath. The only sound came from his boots crunching against the gravel path and the gentle whisper of wind through the pine needles. James paused to take a drink from his water bottle, scanning the horizon out of habit. The rising sun painted the clouds in shades of pink and gold, creating a peaceful scene that still amazed him even after all these years. His radio crackled with routine morning checks from the base, breaking the silence momentarily before returning to static. The path ahead narrowed as it approached one of the steeper sections of the mountain. Early morning mist still clung to the cliffs, creating ghostly shapes that drifted between the rocks. James had walked this route hundreds of times, but something about this morning made him more alert. Years of military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, they were telling him this would not be an ordinary patrol. He checked his watch, 0630. The base would be coming alive now, with recruits starting their morning drills. From his elevated position, he could faintly hear the distant sound of reveille playing across the valley. The familiar tune carried on the wind, reminding him of his own days as a young soldier, before he had seen combat, before he had learned what real fear felt like. Little did James know that in the next few minutes, his morning patrol would transform into something that would test every skill he had learned in his military career and challenge everything he thought he knew about courage, compassion, and the connection between humans and wild animals. The first sign that something was wrong came as a faint sound carried on the wind. James stopped mid-stride, his military training kicking in as he listened intently. There it was again, a sound that seemed out of place among the normal mountain noises. Not quite a cry, not quite a whimper, but something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Moving closer to the cliff edge, James scanned the rocky face below. The morning mist still hung in patches, making visibility difficult. The sound came again, clearer this time. It reminded him of a dog in pain, but something about it was different. He knew these mountains harbored all kinds of wildlife, from mountain lions to black bears. But this sound spoke of desperation. James pulled out his binoculars, methodically scanning the cliff face section by section. The mist began to clear as the morning sun grew stronger, revealing more of the jagged rocks below. The sound echoed again, bouncing off the cliff walls and making it difficult to pinpoint its source. But this time, he caught a slight movement about 30 feet down. His heart nearly stopped when he finally saw it. A small black bear cub, no bigger than a large dog, lay trapped on a narrow rock ledge. Its dark fur was matted with dirt, and one of its back legs appeared to be wedged deeply in a crack in the rock. The young bear's eyes were wide with fear, and its cries grew more desperate as it spotted James above. The ledge the bear was trapped on could not have been more than 3 feet wide. One side pressed against the sheer cliff face, while the other dropped off into a 100-foot ravine. Small rocks scattered down the cliff as the bear struggled, each movement threatening to send it plunging into the abyss below. James felt his throat tighten as he watched the young animal's desperate attempts to free itself. In all his years of mountain patrols, he had never encountered anything like this. The bear could not have been more than a year old, barely old enough to be away from its mother. Speaking of which, where was the mother bear? He quickly scanned the surrounding area, knowing full well how dangerous a protective mother bear could be. The cub let out another cry, this one so filled with fear and exhaustion that it made James's chest ache. He could see now that the bear had worn itself out trying to escape, its movements becoming weaker. How long had it been trapped there? Hours? Days? The thought of the young animal suffering alone through the cold mountain night made his decision even harder. Training and common sense told him to call it in and wait for wildlife services. But something in the bear's eyes, something in those frightened cries, touched a part of him that had seen too much suffering in war zones across the world. The same part that had once made him run into gunfire to save a wounded civilian. The bear's gaze met his, and in that moment, James knew this would not be a normal morning patrol. This would become something much more significant, something that would challenge everything he knew about wild animals and human limits. James lay flat on his stomach at the cliff's edge, using his military training to analyze every detail of the situation below. The bear cub's leg was wedged deep into a crevice, and from his vantage point, he could see patches of blood where the young animal had struggled against the sharp rocks. The cub's breathing appeared labored, its small chest heaving with each exhausted breath. The cliff face itself presented numerous challenges. Loose rocks dotted the surface, their unstable nature evident from the way they shifted with each movement of the trapped cub. The narrow ledge where the bear lay trapped showed signs of crumbling at its edges. Fresh cracks in the rock suggested that time was not on their side. The ledge could give way at any moment. Looking up at the sky, James noticed dark clouds gathering in the distance. The mountain weather was notorious for changing without warning, and the approaching storm system threatened to make an already dangerous situation deadly. The temperature would drop significantly if the storm hit, and rain would make the rocks treacherously slippery. He pulled out his radio, knowing protocol demanded he call this in. The static crackled as he pressed the transmit button. Base Command, this is Staff Sergeant Miller. I have a situation on the north face of Thunder Ridge. Over. The response came back broken and unclear. The mountain's terrain often created dead zones for radio signals, and he appeared to be in one. Making another attempt, James tried to reach the local wildlife services. The response was equally disappointing, only static filling the air. The realization hit him that he was completely alone in this situation. The closest help was at least 2 hours away, even if he could get a clear signal to call them. The bear cub let out another weak cry, drawing James's attention back to its deteriorating condition. Signs of dehydration were evident in its sunken eyes and dry nose. Without water and trapped in the direct sun, the young animal would not survive much longer. The cub's movements had become notably weaker in just the short time he had been observing. A strong gust of wind brought the first hint of the approaching storm. The temperature had already begun to drop, and James could smell rain in the air. He estimated they had less than an hour before the storm hit. The weather report he had checked that morning flashed through his mind, warning of severe thunderstorms with potential flash floods. The sound of falling rocks drew his attention back to the ledge. A section near the bear had just crumbled away, making the already precarious perch even more dangerous. The cub pressed itself harder against the cliff face, trembling with fear. Its eyes locked with James's again, and this time he saw something that struck deep into his heart, pure desperation. Time was running out. Each passing minute reduced the chances of a successful rescue. The approaching storm, the unstable ledge, the bear's worsening condition, all these factors created a deadline that could not be ignored. James knew he needed to make a decision, and he needed to make it now. Years of military training ran through James's mind like a warning siren. Every protocol, every safety regulation told him to wait for backup. His instructor's voice echoed in his memories. Never compromise your safety for a wild animal. But 20 years of service had also taught him that sometimes rules needed to be broken to save a life. The memories flooded back, taking him to a different time and place. 3 years ago, in a remote Afghan village, he had made a similar choice. A young girl trapped in a collapsed building, everyone telling him to wait for the engineering unit. But he had gone in anyway, trusting his instincts, and that decision had saved her life. This situation felt hauntingly similar. despite the vast differences. James understood the risk with crystal clarity. One wrong move on the unstable cliff face could send both him and the bear plunging to their deaths. The approaching storm would make the rocks slick and treacherous. If the mother bear suddenly appeared, he would be in an impossible position with no escape route. The military had not trained him for animal rescue. This was far outside his expertise. The bear cub's weakening cries pulled at something deep inside him. In its eyes, he saw the same fear he had witnessed in countless rescue operations. Fear knew no species. Pain knew no boundaries. His commanding officer's words rang in his ears. A soldier's duty is to protect life. The regulation book did not specify what kind of life. The weight of his satellite phone felt heavy in his pocket. He could try one more time to call for help, wait for the professionals to arrive. But looking at the darkening sky and the crumbling ledge, James knew the cub did not have that kind of time. Nature was not going to wait for proper protocols and procedures. In that moment, staring down at the trapped bear, James made his decision. 20 years of military service had prepared him for this moment, not through training protocols, but through teaching him when to trust his gut. The same instinct that had saved lives in combat zones was telling him to act now. The decision settled in his chest like a familiar weight, similar to the moment before a difficult mission. He knew the risks, understood the consequences, but something deeper than training was driving him now. Sometimes the right choice was not the safe choice. Sometimes being a soldier meant following your heart instead of your orders. Moving quickly but methodically, James emptied his patrol backpack. Each item could mean the difference between success and disaster. His climbing rope, normally used for routine trail maintenance, would serve as a lifeline. A thermal blanket, water bottle, first aid kit, and heavy-duty gloves completed his rescue gear. His military training shone through as he checked each piece of equipment twice. The initial strategy formed in his mind like a tactical mission. He identified 3 sturdy anchor points for his rope, remembering his mountaineering training. The largest boulder near the cliff edge would serve as the main anchor. James wrapped the rope around it, testing the hold with his full weight. The knots he tied were the same ones that had saved lives during mountain rescue operations in Afghanistan. With everything secured, James began his descent. The rock face felt rough and unstable under his hands. Small pieces crumbled away at his touch, raining down into the ravine below. Every movement had to be carefully planned. Too fast and he risked spooking the bear. Too slow and the weather would catch up with them both. 20 feet down, disaster struck. A seemingly solid handhold broke away without warning. James slammed against the cliff face, sending a shower of rocks tumbling down. The sound echoed through the canyon like gunfire. The bear cub, already terrified, began thrashing wildly in its trap. Its panic threatened to bring down the entire ledge. The young bear's fear response was immediate and violent. Its cries turned into frightened growls. Teeth bared in a defensive display that reminded James just how wild this animal truly was. Despite its weakened state, the cub's survival instincts kicked in full force. It swiped at the air with its free palm, making any approach to the ledge impossible. James hung suspended, watching as his first rescue attempt unraveled. The cub's movements became more frantic, each struggle sending more rocks cascading into the abyss. The ledge groaned under the increased activity, small cracks appearing in its surface. They were running out of time, and this direct approach had only made things worse. Blood trickled down James's forearm where the rough rock had torn through his sleeve during the fall. The sting reminded him of the harsh reality of the situation. He had underestimated the challenges of approaching a frightened wild animal in such a precarious position. Military training had prepared him for many things, but this required a different approach. Slowly, carefully, he pulled himself back up to the cliff top. The failed attempt had cost them precious time, and the storm clouds now loomed much closer. But watching the bear's frightened reaction had taught him something valuable. If he was going to save this animal, he needed to earn its trust first. Force and speed would not work here. This mission required patience, something every good soldier needed to learn. Back at the cliff's edge, James tried a new approach. He remembered how the combat medics would calm injured civilians, their voices soft and steady, even in the midst of chaos. Taking a deep breath, He began speaking to the bear in low, gentle tones. The words themselves did not matter, only the calm rhythm of his voice carrying down to the frightened animal. At first, the bear cub maintained its defensive posture, but as minutes passed, something changed. Its growl softened and its rapid breathing began to slow. James kept talking, his voice barely above a whisper, sharing stories of other rescues, other moments when hope seemed lost. The young bear's eyes remained fixed on him, but the fear in them gradually gave way to exhaustion and something that looked like curiosity. The first drops of rain began to fall, scattered and light. Thunder rumbled in the distance, closer now than before. The temperature had dropped significantly, and wind gusts tugged at James's clothing. But something extraordinary was happening on that cliff face. Each time he moved slightly closer to the edge, the bear cub watched him without panic. Their eyes met and held, an understanding passing between species that defied explanation. James unwrapped a protein bar, his movements slow and deliberate. The bear's nose twitched at the scent, hunger momentarily overriding fear. Breaking off a small piece, he let it fall near the cub. The young animal stretched its neck toward the food, managing to reach it despite its trapped position. This simple act of feeding seemed to cement something between them, a fragile trust born of desperation and compassion. The storm's approach cast dark shadows across the mountain, making the cliffside even more treacherous. Wind whipped around them with increasing force, carrying the promise of heavy rain. But in this moment, surrounded by growing danger, James witnessed something remarkable. The bear cub had stopped struggling against its trap, instead watching him with what could only be described as trust. This trust would mean the difference between life and death and what was to come. As another crack appeared in the ledge, James knew they were out of time. The bond they had formed in these precious minutes would be tested in the most dramatic way possible. The first heavy raindrops struck James's face as he prepared for his second descent. This time he added a second safety rope and secured his gear tightly to his body. The wind had picked up, howling through the canyon like a wild beast. Every second counted now, as the storm unleashed its fury upon the mountain. His descent began more carefully this time. Each movement was calculated, each step tested before taking his full weight. The wet rocks gleamed dangerously in the dim stormlight. 20 feet down, he passed the point where his first attempt had failed. The bear cub watched his approach, no longer showing signs of fear, but rather an almost hopeful anticipation. Suddenly, a deafening crack split the air. A section of the cliff face above the bear gave way, releasing a cascade of rocks. James pressed himself against the cliff, feeling debris rain down around him. The cub let out a terrified cry as rocks pelted its exposed body. The ledge supporting the young bear shifted ominously, dropping several inches in one heart-stopping moment. Through the chaos, James made a decision that went against every survival instinct. Instead of retreating, he pushed off from his position, swinging toward the crumbling ledge. The momentum carried him directly to the bear, just as the last support beneath it began to give way. His hands found purchase on the rough stone beside the trapped animal. The ledge groaned beneath their combined weight. Rain poured down now, making every surface treacherous. James could feel the rock face vibrating, threatening to collapse at any moment. The bear cub pressed against him, its wet fur brushing his arm as he examined its trapped leg. The narrow crevice held the limb like a stone vise. Working with desperate speed, James pulled out his emergency water bottle. He poured the contents around the trapped leg, hoping to create some lubrication in the narrow space. The cub remained surprisingly still, as if understanding that this strange human was its only hope for survival. Together they were suspended in space, connected by circumstance and trust. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the sheer drop below them. Thunder followed immediately, so close it made the entire cliff face tremble. In that bright moment, James saw what he needed to do. The cub's leg was wedged at an angle. If he could lift the young bear's body while pushing its leg in the opposite direction, there might be just enough space to work it free. Taking a deep breath, James wrapped one arm securely around the bear's body. The cub tensed but did not struggle. With his other hand braced against the rock wall, he began to lift. The young bear seemed to understand, pushing with its good legs to help. For several heart-pounding seconds, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden release of pressure, the trapped leg slipped free. The unexpected freedom caused them both to lurch backward. James's safety ropes pulled tight, the only thing preventing them from plunging into the abyss. The bear cub clung to him instinctively, its claws digging into his jacket. They hung suspended in the pouring rain. Man and bear, rescuer and rescued, their hearts beating in shared terror and triumph. The immediate relief of freeing the bear's leg quickly gave way to a new crisis. The ledge beneath them began to crumble completely, victim to the pounding rain and their combined movement. James held the bear cub tightly as chunks of rock broke away on either side. The young animal trembled against him, no longer struggling, but clinging to its unlikely savior. Blood from the bear's injured leg mixed with rainwater, creating crimson streams that ran down the cliff face. The wound looked worse now that it was free, revealing deep gashes where the sharp rocks had cut into flesh. The cub would need medical attention soon, but first they had to survive the next few minutes. Another section of the ledge collapsed, leaving them with barely enough space to maintain their position. James tried to reach his radio, hoping to call for backup, but the movement caused more rocks to break loose. The bear whimpered, pressing closer to him as thunder boomed overhead. Their survival now depended entirely on working together, a concept that seemed impossible just hours ago. James felt his arms burning from the strain of holding both himself and the bear secure. The safety ropes creaked ominously in the wind, and the cliff face offered no safe path up or down. The storm had turned the entire mountain into a deadly obstacle, with water rushing down the rocks in small rivers. Each flash of lightning revealed their desperate situation in stark detail. In this moment of crisis, something extraordinary happened. The bear cub, sensing their shared peril, began to move in perfect sync with James. When he shifted his weight to find better handholds, the young animal adjusted its position to maintain their balance. Their movements became a coordinated dance of survival, each one anticipating the other's needs. The breakthrough came when James spotted a narrow path that zigzagged up the cliff face. It would require perfect timing and complete trust between them. The bear seemed to understand his intentions, following his lead as they began their slow ascent. Each movement had to be precise. One mistake would send them both plunging into the canyon below. Step by step, handhold by handhold, they climbed through the driving rain. The bear cub showed remarkable patience, waiting for James's guidance before each move. Its injured leg dragged slightly, but the young animal's determination matched his own. They were no longer rescuer and victim, but partners in survival. Finally, after what seemed like hours but could only have been minutes, James's hand found the solid ground of the cliff top. With one final surge of strength, he pulled himself and the bear to safety. They collapsed together on the wet grass, both breathing heavily, both alive against impossible odds. As the rain began to ease, James expected the bear cub to flee into the forest. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The young bear remained close to him, showing no intention of leaving. Its behavior completely contradicted everything James knew about wild animals, especially after traumatic experiences. While examining the bear's injured leg, James discovered something that made his heart stop. Around the cub's neck, nearly hidden by wet fur, was a worn leather collar. This was no ordinary wild bear. The collar bore a small metal tag with faded writing that revealed an extraordinary story. This bear cub had once been part of a wildlife rehabilitation program. The tag contained information about the cub's history. It had been rescued as a tiny orphan months ago, raised by wildlife experts, and recently released back into the wild. But something had gone wrong during the reintegration process, leading to this near-fatal accident on the cliff. The cub's unusual comfort with human presence suddenly made sense. James found himself facing an impossible decision. Protocol dictated that he should contact the wildlife authorities immediately. But as he looked into the bear's trusting eyes, he realized this situation required something more. The young animal's injured leg needed immediate medical attention, and its behavior suggested it was not ready for life in the wild. Without hesitation, the cub pressed against James's leg, seeking comfort and protection. This simple action sealed their fate. In that moment, James knew he would not simply report this incident and walk away. Something profound had formed between them during those terrifying moments on the cliff, a bond that transcended the natural barriers between humans and wild animals. The descent down the mountain trail proved challenging with an injured bear cub as a companion. James moved slowly, constantly aware of the young animal's painful limp. The storm had left the path slick and treacherous, requiring careful navigation. But what amazed him most was how the bear stayed close, following him like a loyal friend rather than a wild animal. Every few minutes, James would stop to check on his unusual companion. The cub's trust in him seemed to grow with each passing step. When the trail became too steep or slippery, the young bear would wait patiently as James found safer routes. Their synchronized movements showed a level of understanding that defied natural law. As they approached the lower elevations, James began to hear the distant sounds of the military base. The bear cub tensed at the unfamiliar noises, but remained close to him, seeking reassurance in his presence. Their shared ordeal on the cliff had created something unprecedented, a bridge between two worlds that normally remain separate. The sight of Staff Sergeant James Miller walking toward the base gates with a bear cub by his side created quite a stir. Security personnel rushed to respond, but stopped in their tracks when they saw the remarkable scene unfolding. The young bear stayed perfectly calm, pressing against James's leg as people gathered to witness this extraordinary moment. Base authorities quickly contacted Wildlife Services, and within hours, the bear cub was receiving proper medical care. James's discovery of the rehabilitation collar led to a reunion with the Wildlife Center that had originally rescued the young animal. But this was not the end of their story. The bond formed on that dangerous cliff would continue, leading to changes in wildlife rehabilitation procedures and a new understanding of the connections possible between humans and wild animals. The events of that stormy morning would be remembered not just as a daring rescue, but as a testament to the extraordinary things that can happen when compassion overrides fear and trust bridges the gap between species. Like and subscribe to see more amazing stories of unexpected friendships and incredible rescues from around the world. Follow us to witness heartwarming moments where humans and animals come together in extraordinary ways. Be the first to see our weekly updates of remarkable tales that prove compassion knows no boundaries. Hit that notification bell to never miss another story that will touch your heart and inspire your soul.